Get this trash out of my line of sight before my investors arrive. The man in the $5,000 suit barked, pointing directly at the woman in the faded trench coat. Harper didn't flinch, didn't cry, and didn't move. Her thumb simply brushed against the heavy, unmarked black card hidden deep inside her pocket. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, but Julian had no idea he was currently screaming at the only person who held the deed to the ground he was standing on. The clinking of champagne glasses in the ultra-exclusive Apex Summit Lounge came to a dead halt. Everyone was staring at the woman sitting in the velvet corner booth, looking like she had just crawled out of a construction site. Harper rubbed her temples, exhausted. She had been on a flight for 10 hours, coming straight from a grueling site inspection in Denver. Her oversized trench coat was dusty, her sensible flat shoes were scuffed, and her hair was tied back in a messy knot. All she wanted was 10 minutes of silence and a cup of black coffee before the main event started. But Julian Thorne, the newly appointed regional director of Novatech, wasn't having it. "Did you hear me?" Julian snapped, slamming his hand down on Harper's table, making her plain white coffee cup rattle. "This is the VIP Founders Lounge. It costs $50,000 a year just to scan your palm at the door. You're making the space look cheap." Harper slowly looked up from her phone. She noted his custom-tailored Italian suit, the flashy Rolex on his wrist, and the vein popping in his forehead. She didn't look intimidated. She looked profoundly bored. "I'm just drinking my coffee," Harper replied, her voice calm and steady. "I have a right to be here." "A right?" Julian scoffed loudly, ensuring the other wealthy patrons heard him. He turned to a group of men in suits who chuckled on cue. "Let me guess. You sneaked in through the catering entrance, or are you the new cleaning staff? If so, you missed a spot on my shoes." He kicked his polished leather shoe toward her chair. Harper pulled her feet back, her eyes narrowing slightly. Inside her coat pocket, her fingers traced the edges of an unmarked black metal card. It was a card that didn't just grant access to this room. It granted access to the entire city block. "I suggest you walk away, sir," Harper said softly. "You are making a scene." Julian leaned in close, his cologne overpowering and sickening. "I don't walk away from nobodies. I have them removed." He raised his hand and snapped his fingers sharply at the two burly security guards standing by the glass doors, pointing directly at Harper's booth. The two security guards began marching across the marble floor, their heavy boots echoing in the sudden silence of the lounge. Harper didn't reach for her bag to leave. She opened her phone's web browser. "Here they come." Julian sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. "Save yourself the embarrassment of being dragged out. Get up, take your little thrift store coat, and go out the back door." Harper kept her eyes glued to her phone screen. She wasn't looking at her bank account or a text from a friend. She was pulling up the master tenant database for the Apex Tower. It took her only 3 seconds to find Novatech, floor 42. "I'm waiting," Julian barked. "You shouldn't raise your voice in a professional environment," Harper murmured, scrolling through the data. "It projects insecurity." The audacity of her calm tone made Julian's face turn a dangerous shade of red. Julian thought he was breaking her spirit, completely unaware that Harper was currently reading his company's confidential financial standing. "Excuse me, sir?" one of the security guards said, arriving at the table. He looked at Harper with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Miss, I'm going to have to ask to see your access credentials or ask you to leave. This area is restricted to Platinum members only." "She doesn't have credentials," Julian interrupted loudly. "Look at her. She smells like cheap transit. My major investors are walking through those doors in exactly 20 minutes. If they see her, they'll think this building is letting just anyone off the streets in." Harper finally locked her phone screen. She had seen enough. Novatech was 3 months behind on their rent, and their lease was pending a critical review. Julian wasn't a king. He was a desperate man fronting with borrowed money. She looked up at the security guard. "I don't have a Platinum membership." Julian let out a loud, triumphant laugh. "I knew it. Get her out of here. Drag her by her hair if you have to." Harper slowly reached into her pocket, but before she could pull out the black card, an unexpected voice broke through the tension. "Actually, sir, she was just leaving," a trembling voice said from behind Julian. A young waiter holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres stepped forward looking terrified but determined. It was Mateo. Harper had noticed him earlier. He was the only staff member who had offered her a warm smile when she walked in looking exhausted. He stepped between Julian and the table, his hands shaking slightly, trying to defuse the situation. I was just about to show her to the lobby, Mateo stuttered, looking back at Harper with pleading eyes, silently begging her to just walk away and avoid getting hurt. Did anyone ask you, boy? Julian snapped, turning his rage onto the young waiter. The crowd in the lounge began to murmur, and unfortunately, they were firmly on Julian's side. Just kick her out, a woman draped in diamonds sighed from the next booth. Julian is right, the standards here are dropping. She's probably a beggar who slipped past the front desk, another man added, sipping his scotch. Harper sat perfectly still, absorbing every word, every face. They thought she was trapped in a corner, humiliated and helpless. But what they didn't know was that Harper possessed a photographic memory, and she was mentally logging the face of every single person who spoke. Most of them were her tenants, and their leases were up for renewal next month. I can walk myself out if I choose to, Harper said calmly, but I have no intention of leaving my seat. Julian stepped into Mateo's space aggressively, bumping the waiter's shoulder. You tried to cover for her. You're both pathetic. This entire building is designed for the elite, not for street trash, and certainly not for incompetent tray pushers. Mateo looked down, his face burning bright red in front of the entire VIP room. Harper's grip on her phone tightened. She was used to people insulting her appearance. She didn't care, but attacking a young, hard-working kid who was just trying to help, that crossed a very hard line. Leave him alone, Harper said, her voice dropping an octave, losing its previous softness. Julian smirked, thinking he had finally struck a nerve. Or what? What are you going at to? Harper tapped a sequence of numbers into her phone, hit send, and stared dead into Julian's eyes. I'm going to take away your favorite toy. Julian barked out a laugh, clearly thinking Harper was delusional. But exactly 4 seconds after she hit send, the power panel on the VIP elevator across the room flashed red. My toy, Julian mocked. Are you insane, security? Why is she still sitting there? Remove her immediately. The guards stepped forward, but their radios suddenly buzzed with static. A frantic voice came over the channel. All units, we have a system anomaly. The private elevators to floor 42 are locked down. Repeat, floor 42 is completely locked out of the grid. Julian froze. Floor 42 was the Novatech penthouse. It was his floor. What did they just say? Julian demanded, looking at the guards. Why is my floor locked? Harper casually took a sip of her coffee. It had gone cold, but she didn't mind. She had just sent a direct override command to the building's central server. She hadn't revealed her identity yet, but she didn't need to. She was already dismantling his world piece by piece. It's probably a glitch, Mr. Thorne, the guard stammered, tapping his radio. We'll get maintenance on it. It better be a glitch, Julian yelled, panic briefly flashing in his eyes. He had investors arriving in less than 15 minutes. If he couldn't take them up to the penthouse to show off the expensive view, his entire pitch would be ruined. Fix it now. Do you know who I am? You're a man who is 3 months delinquent on a $40,000 lease, Harper stated plainly into the quiet room. The silence that followed was deafening. The wealthy patrons who had been laughing just a minute ago suddenly stopped. Julian's face drained of color, then flushed with absolute fury. How? How do you know that? Julian hissed, leaning across the table, his spit flying. Did you hack my company? You're a corporate spy. That's what you are. He pointed a shaking finger at her. Julian was so blinded by his own ego that he couldn't see the obvious truth. She didn't hack the building, she owned it. Security, arrest her, Julian screamed. She's stealing confidential data. Julian didn't wait for the guards. He lunged across the table, his hand grasping violently for Harper's phone to destroy her evidence. Before Julian's hand could grab Harper's phone, Mateo threw himself forward, blocking Julian's arm with his serving tray. The tray slammed into Julian's wrists, sending champagne glasses crashing to the marble floor in a shower of glass. "Don't touch her!" Mateo shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Julian recoiled, holding his wrist. He looked down at the shattered glass, then up at the young waiter, his arrogant face twisted into something ugly and malicious. He wasn't just annoyed anymore. He was humiliated, and he needed someone to destroy. "You little rat," Julian hissed. He turned to the security guards, who were frozen in shock. "Call the general manager right now. I want this waiter fired. No, I want him blacklisted from every hospitality agency in this city. He assaulted me. I didn't—" Mateo panicked, stepping back. "You were going to grab her." "Shut up," Julian roared. "You're done. Your career is over. You'll be lucky to find work scrubbing toilets when I'm through with you." Mateo's shoulders slumped. The fight drained out of him as the reality of his situation set in. He was just a catering student trying to pay off his tuition. Fighting a man in a $5,000 suit was a battle he could never win. Tears welled up in the young man's eyes. Harper stood up. It was a slow, deliberate movement. She didn't yell. She didn't throw a fit. But the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian thought he was asserting his dominance, but he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had targeted an innocent. "He is not fired," Harper said, her voice cutting through the room like a steel blade. Julian turned his venom back to her. "You think you can save him? You can't even save yourself, you pathetic spy. My investors are walking into this lobby right now, and when my general manager gets here, you are going to be leaving in handcuffs." Harper looked at Mateo, giving him a reassuring nod. She pulled her phone back out. "Bring your investors," Harper said coldly, "and bring the general manager." "Oh, he's already here," Julian smirked, pointing toward the heavy glass doors, where a tall, gray-haired man in a crisp suit was marching toward them, looking furious. Mr. Sterling, the general manager of the Apex Summit, pushed through the glass doors, followed closely by 3 stern-looking men, holding expensive briefcases, Julian's much-anticipated investors. Julian instantly smoothed his tie and plastered on a fake, charismatic smile. He walked right past Harper, stepping over the broken glass to greet the powerful men. "Gentlemen, welcome," Julian announced loudly. "I apologize for the scene. We just have a minor security breach. A vagrant wandered in, and one of the incompetent staff members tried to protect her. Mr. Sterling is handling it right now." Sterling, a man known for his ruthless efficiency, stopped at the edge of the shattered glass. He looked at Mateo, who was trembling, and then his eyes landed on Harper. "Mr. Sterling," Julian said, his tone turning authoritative, "I want this waiter fired immediately for assault, and I want this woman handed over to the police for corporate espionage. She somehow hacked into our payment systems." The investors exchanged uneasy glances. "Julian, what is going on here?" the lead investor asked, frowning. "You said the penthouse was secure. Why are the elevators locked down?" "It's her doing." Julian pointed at Harper, trying to deflect the blame. "She's trying to sabotage my presentation. Mr. Sterling, get her out." Sterling didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on Harper. Sterling wasn't looking at Harper with disgust, nor was he reaching for his radio to call the police. He was looking at her coat, her scuffed shoes, and the absolute calm in her eyes. Harper reached into her deep pocket. Her fingers finally closed around the cold, heavy metal of the black card. She pulled it out and placed it gently on the table next to her coffee cup. The card caught the ambient light, reflecting a faint engraved golden crown. Mateo stared at the card. The security guard stared at the card. Julian, however, was too busy trying to impress his investors to notice what was sitting on the table. "Well, Sterling, do your job," Julian barked. Sterling took a deep breath, adjusted his jacket, and took a deliberate step toward Harper, his expression completely unreadable. "I demand you remove her this instant, or I am breaking my lease," Julian threatened, thinking his words carried the weight of a multi-million-dollar contract. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Thorne," Harper said quietly. She didn't look at Julian. Her eyes were locked on Sterling. Julian let out an exasperated sigh. Why is she still talking? "Sterling, I am a regional director. My company brings prestige to this building. You are humiliating me in front of the board of directors from Vanguard Holdings." He gestured to the 3 investors behind him. Julian believed these men were his golden ticket, a massive cash injection that would save his failing company and cover the rent he couldn't afford. "Julian," the lead investor from Vanguard interrupted, his voice tight. "We need to talk about your financials, right now." "Of course, sir." Julian smiled greasily, and just as soon as security removes the trash. He turned to Harper, a nasty grin on his face. This is what happens when you pretend to play in the big leagues. You get crushed by the people who actually own the world. Harper finally picked up the black card. She held it loosely between her fingers. "You talk a lot about ownership, Julian, but you don't own your company. You don't own your penthouse. You don't even own the suit you're wearing. It's rented." Julian's jaw dropped. "Shut up. You're in debt," Harper continued, her voice echoing perfectly in the silent room. "You brought these investors here to trick them into paying your overdue bills. You thought you could act like a tyrant to cover up the fact that you are entirely powerless." Achishishad. Julian's face twisted in pure rage. The investors behind him were no longer looking confused. They were looking furious. "Sterling!" Julian screamed, completely losing his composure. "Throw this lying witch out into the street before I buy this whole damn building and fire you myself." Sterling finally spoke, his voice booming across the lounge, but he wasn't looking at Julian at all. He was looking at the woman in the faded trench coat. "Are you finished screaming, Mr. Thorne?" Sterling asked, his voice dripping with absolute ice. Julian blinked, taken aback by the general manager's tone. "Excuse me." Sterling ignored him. He stepped carefully over the broken champagne glasses, completely bypassing Julian. The security guards, who had been waiting for the order to grab Harper, suddenly stood at rigid attention. Sterling stopped 2 feet away from Harper's booth. He didn't yell. He didn't ask for her ID. Instead, the ruthless general manager of the most exclusive building in the city placed his right hand over his chest and bowed at a perfect 45-degree angle. "Welcome back, Madam Chairwoman," Sterling said loudly, ensuring every single person in the VIP lounge heard him. "I apologize for the disturbance. Your flight was early." The entire room seemed to stop breathing. The wealthy patrons who had mocked her dropped their jaws. The woman draped in diamonds actually choked on her drink. Julian froze. His brain short-circuited. "Chairwoman? What? What are you talking about?" "Sterling, she's a beggar. She is Harper Pierce," Sterling replied coldly, turning his head slightly toward Julian. "She is the CEO of Apex Global. She doesn't just own this building, Mr. Thorne. She owns the company that owns the building. She is my boss." Julian stepped back as if he had been slapped in the face. His eyes darted to the faded trench coat, the scuffed shoes, and finally to the black metal card resting in her hand, the ultimate master key that only the sole owner possessed. "No," Julian stammered, shaking his head. "No, that's impossible. She looks like someone who just spent 10 hours on a cargo flight inspecting a billion-dollar supply chain." Harper finished for him, finally standing up. She looked taller now, her presence filling the room. Julian swallowed hard sweat suddenly pouring down his forehead. Wait, I can explain. It was a misunderstanding." "It wasn't a misunderstanding." The lead investor from Vanguard stepped forward, pulling a thick folder from his briefcase. "And neither is this." "What is that?" Julian asked, his voice trembling as he looked at the folder in the investor's hand. "This," the lead investor said, tossing the folder onto the table next to Harper, "is a complete audit of Novatech. We finalized it this morning." Julian looked like he was going to vomit. You audited me behind my back, but we were supposed to sign the investment deal today." "There was never an investment deal, Julian," Harper said smoothly. The second twist hit Julian like a freight train. He looked wildly between Harper and the 3 Vanguard investors. "Vanguard Holdings is a subsidiary of Apex Global," Harper explained, her voice devoid of any pity. "They don't work for you. They work for me. I sent them to evaluate your company because you stopped paying my rent 3 months ago. I wanted to see if you were just having a bad quarter or if you were a fraud." She stepped closer to Julian, her eyes locking onto his terrified face. The audit proves you've been falsifying your revenue to attract new capital. You're completely bankrupt, Julian. You haven't had a profitable month in a year. Julian was not just broke. His entire reality had been orchestrated by the woman he had just tried to physically assault. You... Julian gasped, backing away. You set me up. I didn't set you up, Harper replied calmly. I just gave you enough rope to hang yourself. I came here today to give you one final chance. If you had been a decent human being, if you had just sat quietly and drank your coffee, I might have offered you a restructuring plan to save your employees' jobs. But instead you chose to humiliate me, and worse, you tried to destroy an innocent young man's life just to feed your own ego. She gestured toward Mateo, who was staring at her with wide, reverent eyes. Please. Julian whispered, all his arrogance evaporating. He fell to his knees, right in front of the broken glass. Please, Miss Pierce, I'll lose everything. Harper looked down at him, her expression completely unmovable. You already have. Mr. Sterling, Harper said, turning away from the kneeling, broken man on the floor. Execute the eviction protocol. With pleasure, Madam Chairwoman, Sterling replied, a rare smile crossing his strict face. He snapped his fingers at the security guards. Cancel Novatech's lease under the morality and fraud clauses. Lock the penthouse down. Mr. Thorne's personal belongings will be mailed to him. Escort him out. Wait, my computer, my files, Julian cried out as the two guards grabbed him roughly by the arms. They belong to your creditors now, the Vanguard investor stated coldly. Julian kicked and screamed, his expensive suit tearing as he was dragged across the marble floor. The snobbish crowd in the lounge who had supported him earlier now turned their backs, whispering in disgust, pretending they had never associated with him. The heavy glass door slid open, and Julian was thrown out into the public lobby, completely stripped of his power, his wealth, and his dignity. Harper watched him go, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. Justice was rarely this swift, but when you owned the board, you didn't have to wait. She turned to Mateo. The young waiter was still holding his tray, looking completely paralyzed. Mateo wasn't it? Harper asked, her voice returning to the gentle tone she had used earlier. Yes, ma'am, he stuttered. You stood up for someone you thought was powerless, knowing it could cost you everything, Harper said, picking up her coat. Sterling, transfer Mateo to the executive corporate team. Double his salary and pay off whatever tuition he currently owes. Sterling nodded immediately. Consider it done, ma'am. Mateo burst into tears of relief, bowing his head repeatedly. Thank you. Thank you so much. Harper finally slipped her arms into her dusty trench coat. She picked up her cold cup of coffee and her black card. She looked around the silent VIP lounge, her eyes lingering on the wealthy patrons who had mocked her. Enjoy your champagne, everyone, she said softly. I'll be reviewing your lease renewals next week. She walked out of the lounge, leaving the terrified elite behind in absolute silence.